Our next speaker is a young consultant ophthalmologist, a cornea and refractive surgeon from PGI Chandigarh, Dr. Chintan Malhotra, who's going to tell us some talk on a very relevant topic. What are the technologies we have to diagnose a dry eye disease in relevance to refractive surgery? On to you, doctor.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, and thank you to ARC for the invitation. I hope my slides are visible and I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah. So technologies to diagnose dry eye disease are exploding and expanding by the day. We all know that refractive surgery causes dry eyes due to multiple causes. It causes corneal denervation, which leads to an aqueous deficient dry eye. Meibomian gland secretions are decreased, leading to an evaporative dry eye. There's mution deficiency as well as tear film instability. And so it's all the more reason that for patients who are going to undergo refractive surgery, we need to look at dry eye very, very carefully, because any pre-existing dry eye is going to be aggravated very much. Now, once we look at the definition of dry eye, which was given by the TFOS, we know that dry eye includes a loss of homeostasis. Patients have some symptoms. There is tear film instability and hyperosmolarity. There is inflammation, as well as there are neurosensory abnormalities. And as we go on to the tests which are available for dry eye, each of these tests tries to address one or the other aspects of which are present in this definition. As again recommended by the DEWS 2, there's a diagnostic battery of tests for dry eye. But the most important first is that we ask the patient triaging questions or screening, just to rule out conditions which may have similar, sometimes symptoms which simulate dry eye, but are not exactly dry eye, for example, allergic eye disease. And then we go on to test the other parameters, which would show us the homeostasis of the ocular surface. So for the questions, this is a screenshot of my phone, actually, where I have the questionnaire app. The OSDI is available as an app. One can download it. And as one clicks on it, one clicks on begin, it shows the patient visual images and asks questions related to the symptoms, whether they feel gritty, whether they have a foreign body sensation. It asks questions related to vision, showing images so that the patient can understand better, and also the environmental conditions which cause a problem. And at the end of it, it very nicely gives out a report, which can also be saved and compared to the reports on subsequent tests. So it's a very good tool to explain to the patient what problem they have, as well as a record for the future. And a positive symptom score requires a diagnostic cutoff of either greater than 6 on the dry eye questionnaire 5 or greater than 13 on OSDI. So these apps are extremely, extremely useful. Then as we go on to the homeostasis markers, this is the way a lot of us would still be doing tear film stability, where we do the fluorescein assisted tear film breakup time. The only problem is that there's variability in concentration and amount of fluorescein. There's reflex tearing induced by the dye installation, and also simultaneous evaluation of tear breakup across the entire cornea is not possible. So the solution to this is a non-invasive tear breakup time, which is one of the first tests, if not the first test, which should be done if one has access to it. Basically, any topographic system which is available can be used to evaluate changes, because the time taken for the distortion of the Mayas is noted. Of course, the automated systems are much better. For example, the image on the right on an ocular keratograph shows a patient with aqueous deficient dry eye, where we see that these yellow and orange spots are the ones which show the points where the tear film broke up and how quickly it broke up. If one doesn't have access to these complicated equipments, even simple keratometers or any Placido-based imaging can be used for this manually. And DEWS 2 suggested a cutoff value of less than 10 seconds as an indicator for the diagnosis of dry eye disease. The other thing which we come to is the tear film osmolarity, because that's a central factor in the pathogenesis of both aqueous deficient and evaporative dry eye. So either this or the non-invasive TBUT either one of these can be one of the first tests. This is basically a lab on a chip technology, and it uses temperature corrected impedance to provide an indirect assessment of osmolarity. 50 nanoliters of tear sample is corrected in a card, and these pens are placed onto this osmolarity system, and a digital value is given in about 2 minutes. Values of greater than 308 milliosmoles per liter are taken as the threshold for differentiating a normal from a mild dry eye, and more than 316 between a mild and a moderate dry eye. Also importantly, an inter-eye difference of greater than 8 is significant for establishing a diagnosis of dry eye. The drawback of this is that it does not differentiate between an evaporative and an aqueous deficient dry eye, But if we do demonstrate significant hyperosmolarity, then one can go in for lubricants with osmoprotectants, which would probably help the patient better. So that's where it has its value. There's a similar system, I'm not sure if it's available in India, which is the iPin, which directly gives the printout. The one tool which I think is very, very important in clinical practice and a lot of which we are adapting is the infrared meibography and the interferometry. This is combined in the LipiView 2, which I have a personal experience with. Infrared meibography, of course, can be done on any of the simpler machines, including your NCTs, which have the infrared lighting, and that can show the meibomian glands. Coming on to the LipiView 2, it gives us three functions. We see the meibomian glands because the meibum in the glands autofluoresces when illuminated with infrared light. We have the interferometry to evaluate the lipid layer thickness, and also we can measure the partial Brinkleitz that itself can cause dryness. So these are some examples of patients where the infrared images, the glands appear white as seen in the image on the left. On trans illumination, the glands appear dark and the septae in between them appear white. And then you also have a merged image, which kind of gives us a 3D image. These are the normal appearing glands on the left side, where the glands run from the lid margin to the upper border of the tarsus. One may see some distorted glands as seen in the image on the left on top, and sometimes patients can have dilated glands when they have MGD, which is of the obstructive type. So just an example, this is a 60-year-old lady who had foreign body sensation in both eyes, and the signs, I mean, her symptoms are much more in the left as compared to the right eye. And she, on clinical examination, had all the symptoms of a meibomian gland dysfunction, that is decreased expressibility and turbided secretions. And as we go on to the report, which we see in the LipiView, we can see that the lipid layer thickness is lesser in the left eye. The blinks are partial, which contributes to the dry eye. And the images at the bottom show us the quality of her glands. So the glands are distorted, they are shortened, and there is nearly a 30% area where the glands are missing. And if we go on to looking at the interferometry images of her right and left eye, we can see that in the right eye, where the lipid layer was thicker, we can see a much more colored interference fringe as compared to the left eye, where the fringe is not so much there. It's a kind of a featureless tear film. So this is an extremely useful tool to demonstrate to the patient as well what problem they are suffering from, as well as to follow up the patient. And so this patient, she also had a lot of partial blinks, and she's been advised to undergo a thermal pulsation treatment. It's important to mention here that if we have more than a 50 to 75% gland loss, then a thermal pulsation probably won't work. But in a case like this, where the gland loss is less than 30%, this would probably be beneficial. She has yet to undergo it. Another example of a teenage patient complaining of foreign body sensation and itching had a lower lid kind of a chalazion, which never used to go away, along with blepharitis. And we can see on the images how beautifully it's showing that there are areas of gland dropout where the chalazion, the small chalazia were there. In vivo confocal microscopy is more of a research tool, but it definitely shows us the structure of the meibomian glands, where in meibomian gland dysfunction, the glands do tend to become fibrosed, and there are a lot of inflammatory cells, as well as it's been used to image the corneal nerves, which show a beading and increased tortuosity. So this can be a useful quantitative tool in research purposes, but for routine clinical practice, I don't think this is for a dry eye workup. We routinely use it so much. Thank you. I'll just be winding up. ASOCT is something which we use routinely in clinical practice, and it's a useful tool to measure the tear film height and tear film area. It's been shown very well to correlate with the Schirmer's values. If one has a swept source OCT, that's even better because it enables acquisition of three-dimensional images. And this can allow the measurement of their tear meniscus volume in addition to the other parameters, which are tear meniscus height and tear meniscus area. Another very important test is, like we mentioned, ocular surface inflammation is one of the important characteristics of dry eye. And this is a rapid pathogen screening test, the Inflama Dry, which is easily available, costs around 1,500 per test. The MMP9 levels are measured because MMP9 has been shown to be an important inflammatory mediator in dry eye. And this basically is a simple in-office test where the testing tip is touched to the inferior palpebral conjunctiva. No other drops have been instilled. And once a minimum of 6 to 8 dabs have been taken, this is put in the buffer solution, and then it shows a red and a blue line, which shows us that the test is positive. A 40 microgram per milliliter level of MMP9 is taken as a cutoff point. So if it's more than 40, it does signify that the patient has a significant amount of inflammation. Where this could help us clinically is treating patients with anti-inflammatory agents, for example, cyclosporin or tacrolimus, might be more beneficial in these patients. We have a lot of other point of care dry eye tests, for example, lactoferrin testing, which is done somewhat similar to this MMP9. Lactoferrin levels are reduced in patients with aqueous deficient dry eye, and any result below 0.9 is considered to be aqueous deficient. IgE levels can also be measured, and this would be helpful more in allergic disorders. There are a lot of other technologies. As we know that the tear film is the first ocular surface, and we can do the wavefront and the aberrometry is altered. Aberrations are higher in dry eye, and functional vision and thermography are something which are coming into vogue, but I still think they remain more in the realm of research than routine clinical practice. So for a take-home message, newer technologies are expanding day by day. All patients do not need every investigation. Customization is important, and a good clinical exam will always guide the appropriate investigations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. That was a wonderful talk. You did cover a lot of it. I just want one question, if Dr. Merle or Dr. Kumar there. In a case of a rheumatoid arthritis patient and inactive state, if the corneal surface is stable, would you consider taking up this patient for a refractive surgery on the cornea? Dr. Merle?
I don't think, I don't think I would, because there would be issues with healing, and you never know when the patient can develop a corneal melt. So I don't think it's safe, though I think George Alio's group has described refractive surgery in these patients, but I think nobody else has replicated that data, so I wouldn't actually go ahead.
Any other thought? Yes, it seems most reasonable. Dr. Namrata?
I think what Merle has said is absolutely correct. I think we all would be wary of doing refractive surgery in a rheumatoid, a cornea-based refractive surgery in a case which is rheumatoid arthritis.
Dr. Praveen, you have any question before we go to our last speaker?
No, sorry, I think we should go to our last speaker and then maybe have a quick discussion.